Hello and welcome to Autistic Changeling. Today I'm recording in my parents' room because I'm visiting family, so thanks Mom. And we're going to be talking about the intersection between being autistic and being asexual, aromantic, or trans because it's Pride Month and those are the identities I feel equipped to talk about. Also, I apologize in advance because I'm probably going to be doing this a lot this video because I'm sitting on a spinny chair and it's just too stimmy to resist. So basically, in case you're not familiar with these identities, asexuality, nice shirt, right? Asexuality is a sexual orientation where you don't feel sexual attraction to other people, or where you do, but there's some sort of a but afterwards. So asexuality itself is not feeling sexual attraction to anybody, but asexuality is also a spectrum, which includes other identities like demisexual, which is you don't feel sexual attraction to anyone except if you've known them for a long enough time to feel an emotional connection with them, and that doesn't mean you're definitely going to feel sexual attraction to them. It means the possibility exists there, but it doesn't with anyone else. Or gray asexual, where you might feel sexual attraction, but only in certain circumstances, or only once in a very, very, very long while, or with some other stipulation and some other complicated way. Gray asexuality is more of an umbrella term for a wide variety of experiences that don't fit neatly into asexual or not asexual. The most commonly used term for people who are not asexual is allosexual, but there's been some debate over that term, which I'm not really going to go into here. Aromantic is a similar identity. It is an identity where you don't feel romantic attraction to anybody, or you only feel romantic attraction in certain situations, or after such and such a period of time, so on. Aromantic is also a spectrum, which also includes demi-romantic, gray romantic, and there are other identities within these spectrums, but there's a lot of them, and I'm not going to go into every single one. I think a relevant romantic identity to bring up, and it does have a counterpart in sexual identity, but a relevant one to bring up is quaromantic, which, yes, comes from the French word for what. It's a really interesting linguistic progression because this idea was originally coined as WTF romantic, which wasn't really very easy to say out loud, even though it worked well in text. So Apocryphal, I believe, coined it as quaromantic, which is often defined by other people as referring to being unable to tell the difference between romantic or platonic attraction, or, with sexuality, between sexual attraction and other types of attraction and so on. But I believe the original term was also coined to describe ideas such as, romantic attraction doesn't have a cohesive definition. Romantic attraction doesn't apply to me in this situation. I don't know how to answer that. I don't want to respond to that question. Just the general feeling of, romantic attraction being a series of question marks in varying font types and sizes. So that's a relevant term for this discussion, I think, and I might get into why later in the video. So those are those two identities, and trans is something you're probably more likely to be familiar with, but, just for the sake of completeness, trans is short for transgender. It stands for anybody who was, everyone is assigned a gender identity at birth. The doctors probably say it's a girl or it's a boy, and even intersex people are generally assigned an identity of male or female at birth, often after undergoing surgery they may not have even been told about, which is bad and not a topic I'm really equipped to speak on. So everyone is usually assigned either male or female at birth, but not everyone identifies as that assignment. So some people who are assigned male at birth might actually identify as female, and some people who are assigned female at birth might actually identify as male, and some people who are assigned either at birth might identify as none of the above, or some other combination thereof. So that's basically, trans women, trans men, and non-binary people, all of whom can be included under the label trans or transgender. And fun fact, the white stripe on the trans flag is actually for non-binary people. So not all non-binary people do identify as trans, but a lot do, and they all have the right to identify as trans if they want to, because that stripe on the flag is for us. So Based on the fact that I'm talking about these labels, you've probably already guessed that I'm asexual, aromantic spectrum, and non-binary. So that's why I'm talking about these labels in particular. So now let's move on to how they relate to being autistic and some of the intersectionality there. There's a pretty significant stereotype that autistic people are asexual and aromantic, but I don't think this stereotype is actually what people think it is. So people will say that autistic people are more likely to be stereotyped as asexual or aromantic. I don't think that's the case. I think that autistic people are more likely to be stereotyped as, desexualized, and by extension, deromanticized. We don't have a good word for that because so often people combine sexual and romantic attraction into one experience that we don't have a good word for the romantic equivalent of desexualization. But I think both apply to autistic people, and I think that these are both distinctly separate from being asexual or aromantic. Both because, asexual people can still have sex. I don't want to. I'm sex repulsed, but a lot of asexual people do sometimes have sex for various reasons. They might enjoy the feeling but not feel sexual attraction. They might have other reasons. You'll have to ask, people who actually do that. But I know that it happens. So, that's one element here. But also, I think there's a difference between being desexualized and being asexual. Being desexualized is something other people apply to you. Being asexual is something you apply to yourself and use to describe your own identity and experiences. And I am asexual and sex repulsed, and I am autistic. And I feel like for me there's a difference between me saying, I don't feel sexual attraction, I am sex repulsed and don't want to have sex with anyone, and other people assuming those things about me based on the behaviors that make them realize subconsciously that I'm autistic. Those are two different things. One of them is other people making those decisions for me, and one of them is me making that decision myself. And I feel like, people tend to understand in other areas that there's a difference between you saying something and someone forcing it onto you. Like in school, you might have been ready to do what your instructor was going to tell you to do, and then they come along and correct you on it, and you're like, no, nuh-uh. Like that passive aggressiveness, I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, and it doesn't stop applying when it comes to desexualization. So that is something I feel is worth pointing out, that desexualization is different from asexuality, and desexualization is harmful regardless of the autistic person's actual identity. So autistic people are often desexualized, but that's different from autistic people being assumed to be asexual. Because often the people doing the desexualization don't even know what asexuality is. It's still not an identity that a lot of people know about, and that doesn't stop them from desexualizing us. And the romantic equivalent, which again, we don't even have a word for because people just so often assume they go hand in hand. So that's something I definitely wanted to point out, because I feel like when people try to fight these stereotypes, a lot of the emphasis gets put on autistic people can have sex, autistic people can be sexually attracted to people, autistic people aren't asexual, which is true for a lot of people, but some of us are asexual, and we still don't deserve to be stereotyped and desexualized either, even if we might not actually feel sexual attraction. And this also comes into play when representation is involved, because people often push for non-asexual autistic characters with the reasoning that all of the autistic characters we have are assumed to be asexual. But, and this is something I think is important, a desexualized character is not the same as an asexual character. A character that is desexualized by the show and isn't shown to be interested in sex or whatever might be a character that's easily read as asexual. But that doesn't mean that the character is actually asexual. They might be. It would be a reasonable headcanon. There's no evidence that they're not. But it's different than if they actually said the word and explored the identity and the experiences and the complicated life involved, And I feel like that's different. And I also feel like this is why people are more likely to headcanon autistic-coded characters as asexual. And this is something that often gets blamed on the fans for having these headcanons. But I feel like it's also partly on the show creators who do this coding, because, you know, a character that's coded as asexual, as autistic, sorry, a character that's coded as autistic or is canonically autistic, you know, if the show writers are relying on stereotypes and accidentally desexualizing the character or intentionally desexualizing the character, they're probably not intending to make the character seem asexual, because chances are high they don't know what that means and they don't care. But by desexualizing the character, they do provide cues and make it more likely for asexual people to see themselves in the character, which leads to this cross-headcanoning that tends to frustrate people on both sides of the equation. And this is something that I really feel is on the character creators and the writers who do this, to be more reasonable about the characters that they're creating, to realize that, you know, if your character is asexual, then, you know, you should know that about them. And you should own that. Just like when you're writing an autistic character, you should own that they're autistic. If you're writing an asexual character, you should own that they're asexual. Even if your character doesn't know it, you should know it. And also, if your character isn't asexual, then, you know, don't desexualize them just because they're autistic. You can have other characters desexualize them and then point out that desexualizing autistic people is a thing that happens, but that's different than the writers desexualizing the character. So that's my thoughts on the whole headcanon thing that I've seen people talking about, and all of this also goes for aromantic identities, which again are often cross-coded, and I would say that the writers are even less likely to know about aromantic people than asexual people, so I would say it's even less likely that they're intentionally cross-coding those, because, you know, we have a couple of characters on TV that are mentioned as asexual. I don't think I can think of a single TV character who's canonically aromantic. If you can, let me know, because that would be great, but I can't think of anything. So all of this also applies for aromantic identities. There aren't as many stereotypes about trans people and autistic people, as far as I can tell, except more speculation on whether autistic people are more likely to be trans. And there does appear to be some evidence that there's a level of crossover between being autistic and being trans, or even between being autistic and being, you know, LGBT plus in general. So that's something that people are still looking into, and it's something that it might be difficult to get good data on, because, you know, a lot of autistic people aren't diagnosed, and a lot of LGBT plus people might not want to come out. So there's a level of uncertainty there, but there is some research being done into it, I believe. But regardless, a lot of issues that autistic people who are trans might face is having people not believe them to be capable of making their own decisions about their life and about whether or not they want to transition. Some autistic people face greater barriers when seeing therapists to get letters if they want to go on hormones or get surgery. Therapists might be less likely to believe the autistic person's account of their experiences, or might believe the autistic person is just having a special interest in trans identity and not actually trans themselves, rather than believing what the autistic person says about their experiences and how they feel about themselves and their life. So that's definitely a problem that gets faced. But that doesn't mean that the answer is to say that autistic people are more likely to be trans. They might be, and even if they are, our experiences still matter and should still be believed. But there's other areas of intersectionality here that aren't necessarily related to how other people see us. You know, autistic people might face unique challenges when trying to transition just because of things like sensory issues, you know, like binders are uncomfortable regardless of if you're autistic, but if you're autistic, they might be more uncomfortable. On the other hand, some autistic people might like the binder because it's applying pressure, and that pressure stim can be nice. Personally, I find them itchy and uncomfortable, and they make my anxiety worse because of the pressure, but some people might like it. And, you know, there's other elements that are similar to that might be related. I've seen some people theorize that autistic people are more likely to be trans because we don't get social constructs the same way, and we might not mesh as nicely with the social constructs that society is applying to us. I haven't seen very much research into this, but it's something I think is interesting. With regards to aromantic identity, I think that a large part of the crossover here is based on the stereotype that autistic people don't feel empathy. And honestly, I feel like a lot of the perceived crossover here is based on negative stereotypes, both about autistic people and about aromantic people. Aromantic people are often stereotyped as being unable to love, and so are autistic people. Aromantic people are often stereotyped as lacking empathy and not caring about others, and so are autistic people. These stereotypes happen to coincide, which connects the two identities. I don't know if there is a connection between the two identities. I don't know if there's any research about the romantic orientations of autistic people. But I think that the social connection people might make if they know about the two identities is based on negative stereotypes about both. That said, I do think for myself that there is a connection between being aromantic and being autistic, for me. This is not to say everyone feels this connection, but for me, I think part of it is that I don't know what romantic attraction is. It is confusing, poorly defined for me, and it doesn't seem like something that I can really relevantly apply to my experiences and the relationships that I have in my life. And for me, this is related to being autistic because it's a measure of, you know, that social interaction with other people. Where do I stand with this person? What is the status of our relationship and how do I feel about that? That I find challenging because I'm autistic, and romantic attraction and the concept of romance just makes that even more complicated. So I identify as qua-romantic because this whole question just seems confusing and irrelevant to my life and my practical experiences. That said, I understand that romance is important to a lot of people and that there is some definition that people are apparently able to agree on. I just don't get it. And that's fine. And romantic identity in particular is something that I think a lot of people just don't know about or don't think about. Asexuality is starting to gain a little bit of visibility. Aromantic identities seem to be lagging behind that a little bit. But on the other hand, the greater visibility for asexual people comes at a cost, which is the level of discourse about asexuality and whether or not asexual people belong in the community, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of so-called exclusionists trying to keep asexual people out. And I just want to take this moment to say that as a non-binary, aromantic, asexual, autistic, I firmly believe that aros and aces belong in the queer community, in the LGBT plus community. And I'm not going to debate or argue with exclusionists about this on this channel. But I just want to say that explicitly so that other people who are asexual or aromantic know that they're welcome here. So, thank you for watching. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this video, and have a great Pride Month.